At first glance, it might seem that the US war against Iran is just another story about an old feud, about the nuclear program, about Israel's security, and about the unstable Middle East. But if you look deeper, it becomes clear that everything is much broader. In fact, Iran here is only one part of a huge geopolitical construct in which the interests of Washington, Tel Aviv, global corporations, the military sector, energy markets, and even the future of the world financial system are intertwined. The main mistake most people make is that they try to view the conflict as a local war between two or three states. But such wars have long since ceased to be fought only for the sake of one territory or one regime. Today, any major operation is part of a larger game. If you look at the situation in this way, it becomes obvious. Pressure on Iran is simultaneously pressure on China, on global energy routes, and on the future balance of power in the new world. For Beijing, it's not just a partner in the Middle East, but one of the most important sources of cheap oil. The Chinese industrial model relies on energy, on stable supplies of raw materials, and on the ability to buy resources where the West cannot fully control the conditions. Iran was extremely convenient in this scheme. While some countries are forced to trade by the rules of the American financial system, Tehran and Beijing are building their own bypass mechanisms, creating a more flexible and less dependent circuit for themselves. And it is here, in the center of this whole game, that the Strait of Hormuz appears. It's not just a narrow passage on a map, it's one of the main arteries of the global economy. A colossal volume of oil passes through it, and any tension in this area instantly hits markets, prices, logistics, and investors' nerves. Therefore, the situation around Iran is never limited to Iran itself. It's a question of global access to energy. It's a question of control over oil flows. It's a question of who in the future will be able to dictate terms to the world, the US or its main competitors. But here an extremely important nuance arises. If the goal really was to cut off China's access to Iranian raw materials, in practice it turned out to be not so simple. Even against the backdrop of escalation and threats, supplies of Iranian oil to China have not disappeared. Moreover, the pressure scheme itself has shown its limitations. Formally there is tension, formally the risk is huge, formally the whole world sees a threat, but real flows continue to move. And this means that it is simply impossible to change the strategic balance with a single show of force. This requires a completely different level of involvement, and it's associated with massive risks. And this is where Israel steps in with its own logic. For Tel Aviv, the Iran issue isn't just regional politics. It's an existential threat they've been discussing for many years. The Israeli leadership constantly returns to the topic of Iran's nuclear program, emphasizing that it's not about a hypothetical danger sometime later, but a process that could spiral out of control much sooner than many think. Therefore, for Israel, any moment of Iranian weakness is a window of opportunity that must not be missed. But the problem is that even if Israel's interest is clear, the United States wouldn't get involved in such a situation just for the sake of one ally. This means Washington has its own interests at stake. And this is where the conflict begins to take on a truly modern character. Because it's no longer just about oil, not just about missiles, and not just about geography. It's about a technological era in which wars are becoming part of the infrastructure of a new world. We're already seeing how any major conflict is reflected almost instantly on the stock market. As soon as escalation begins, capital flows into the defense sector. Investors immediately move into companies related to weaponry, intelligence, satellite systems, data analysis, cybersecurity, and military technology. And it's absolutely logical. The higher the global instability, the more states spend on their militaries, the more orders the defense industry receives, and the higher the demand grows for everything related to modern warfare. But what's especially important is that today, war is no longer just about tanks, planes, and missiles. It's also about artificial intelligence, data processing, surveillance systems, automated decision-making, digital coordination, threat forecasting, and managing massive amounts of information in real time. In other words, war is becoming a testing ground for the technologies of the future. Those who provide such solutions don't just profit from the conflict, they also gain the right to shape the architecture of the new technological order. And here we come to the most interesting part, because the next era will be built not just on oil and gas, but on a combination of energy, computing power, and control over financial flows. Artificial intelligence requires a colossal amount of energy. Data centers require stable electricity, rare earth resources, logistics, secure infrastructure, and political will. This means the struggle for the Middle East is also a struggle for the energy foundation of a world where dominance will belong not only to banks and states, but also to technological platforms. Against this backdrop, it becomes clearer why interests at several levels intersect around Iran. The first level is military, the second is energy, the third is technological, and the fourth is financial. Because at the moment when the old world order begins to crack, elites always look for a way not just to maintain control, but to relaunch it on new principles. Today, there is more and more talk about the fragmentation of the global system, about moving away from the dollar, about trading in alternative currencies, about digital assets, and about a new system of settlements between states. And Iran, together with China, has long been involved in finding ways to escape the full control of the old Western model. And here the picture becomes even more alarming because when not only military targets and oil infrastructure, but also the world's largest technology corporations start appearing on the list of potential targets, it means that the very nature of war has already changed. In the past, symbols of power were aircraft carriers, missiles, tank columns, and strategic bombers. Today they have been joined by servers, computing power, cloud platforms, and data centers. Whoever controls the digital infrastructure at a certain point gains no less influence than whoever controls the army. If it previously seemed that tech companies were somehow separate from major geopolitics, now this illusion is literally crumbling before our eyes, because the largest IT giants have long ceased to be just businesses. They have turned into elements of national power. Their clouds store data, their models analyze information, their chips provide computing, and their platforms become part of the defense architecture. This means that a strike against them is no longer just a strike against the private sector. It is a strike against the state's ability to act in the digital age. The issue of artificial intelligence is becoming particularly important. We are witnessing a moment when artificial intelligence stops being a pretty technological toy for presentations and becomes a tool of real power. Moreover, not just a tool, but one of the key resources of the new century. And this is where the conflict reaches a completely different level, because the struggle is no longer just between states, it is already between artificial intelligence companies trying to secure the best position in the future distribution of power, money, and access to government contracts. When some companies get agreements with the defense sector, while others face pressure for refusing to go deeper into the military sphere, it shows a very simple thing. The state has already ceased to be an outside observer in relation to the artificial intelligence industry. It begins to directly shape the winners and the losers. And in such a situation, the tech market increasingly resembles not free competition, but a race for the favor of the political and military machine. The most interesting thing here isn't even who signed the contract, but who refused and what happened next. Because this reveals the main conflict of the new era. To what extent can a tech company even remain independent if its product is capable of changing the balance of power on the battlefield? Can the creator of a powerful model say, "We don't want our technologies to be used for fully autonomous target destruction"? But in practice, such a refusal almost automatically begins to be perceived as a political gesture. And if we're talking about a superpower that considers artificial intelligence a matter of national survival, then any disagreement starts to look almost like a challenge to the system. That's why users might support one company for moral reasons, while the state machine at that same moment will view the situation completely differently. Society still thinks in terms of convenience, ethics, and brand reputation, while the elites are already thinking in terms of strategic advantage, military superiority, and future world leadership. This is one of the main dramas of our time. Technologies that were sold to the world as a way to simplify life are gradually becoming the basis of a new control mechanism and a new architecture of war. But if we go further, it becomes clear that artificial intelligence is only one layer. Beneath it lies an even more fundamental question: money. Because any long war depends not only on weapons, but also on funding channels. And this is where Iran becomes a particularly interesting example. The country has lived under harsh sanctions for decades, restricted in access to the global dollar system, regularly facing blocks, limitations, and pressure. And yet it hasn't just vanished from the map of world trade. It continues to sell oil, continues to find buyers, continues to conduct settlements, and continues to integrate into shadow or alternative financial routes. This means that the old financial system is no longer absolutely airtight. Yes, the dollar still dominates. Yes, Western infrastructure still remains crucial. But the very fact that large volumes of trade can bypass classic channels shows the world is already testing new mechanisms for these settlements. While this was once seen as a peripheral phenomenon, such schemes are now becoming part of a global transition period. That is why the conflict surrounding Iran cannot be seen as a temporary flare-up that will simply end and vanish one day. Even if the fighting dies down, the logic of the process will remain because the dispute is no longer about a specific date or a single operation. The dispute is about who will be the master of the next era. Those who think only in news headlines will see this as just another crisis in the Middle East. Those who look deeper, who truly pay attention, will see the rehearsal of a new world order, one in which war, finance, and technology merge into a single unified mechanism.